James had always loved the sound of horses in the morning. The soft nickering, the gentle stomping of hooves on dirt, and the peaceful silence that came with living on 15 acres of open land. This wasn't just property to him. This was home. This was freedom. He'd bought this ranch 12 years ago with money he'd saved from his years in the military. It wasn't fancy, but it was his. A small house, a sturdy barn, and enough space to train horses and live the quiet life he'd always dreamed about. The kind of life where your nearest neighbor was far enough away that you could actually hear yourself think. But things were changing fast in Riverside County. About 2 years ago, a development company started buying up the land around his ranch. They had big plans. Luxury homes. A gated community. The kind of place where people from the city could come and pretend they lived in the country, while still having all their fancy amenities. James didn't mind at first. He figured live and let live. They could build their houses and he'd keep doing what he'd been doing. After all, his property wasn't part of their homeowners association. His land had been there long before any of these new developments even existed. The first family moved in about 18 months ago. Then another. Then another. Within a year, there were about 30 new homes surrounding his property, and suddenly James wasn't living in peaceful isolation anymore. He had neighbors, lots of them, and apparently they had opinions about how he ran his ranch. It started small, a complaint here and there. Someone didn't like the sound of the rooster in the morning. Another person thought the barn looked old and run down. One woman actually called the county because she said the smell of horses was bothering her during her morning yoga sessions on her deck. James tried to be understanding. These people came from the city. They probably weren't used to farm life. He even went door to door introducing himself, explaining that he ran a working ranch and offered riding lessons to kids from the local community. Most people seemed nice enough to his face, but the complaints kept coming. Then the HOA board got involved. The president of the board was a woman named Patricia. She was the type of person who always looked like she was about to speak to a manager. Perfect hair, perfect nails, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She showed up at James's door one Saturday morning with 2 other board members. "We need to discuss your property," she said. Not even bothering with small talk, James invited them in. But Patricia said they'd prefer to talk outside. As they walked around his property, she pointed out everything she considered a problem. The fence needed painting. The equipment near the barn was an eyesore. The dirt road leading to his property created too much dust. The list went on and on. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concerns," James said calmly, "but my property isn't part of your HOA. I was here first." Patricia's smile got even tighter. "We're aware of that, but you have to understand. Your property affects our property values. We have standards in this community." "And I have rights on my own land," James replied. That's when things really started to escalate. The HOA began sending him letters almost weekly. They cited old county ordinances that nobody had enforced in decades. They claimed his barn violated setback requirements, even though it had been there for 40 years. They said his business of giving riding lessons created too much traffic. They even tried to argue that his horses were too loud and violated noise ordinances. James knew what this was really about. They wanted him gone. His working ranch didn't fit the picture-perfect image they had for their luxury community. Every time they looked out their windows and saw his property, they saw something that didn't belong in their world. He started getting visits from code enforcement officers. They'd show up unannounced, clipboards in hand looking for violations. James kept his property clean and up to code, so they never found anything serious. But it was harassment, plain and simple. They were trying to make his life difficult enough that he'd just give up and leave. The worst part was the community meetings. The HOA held them monthly, and James started getting notices that his property was on the agenda. He went to one meeting sitting in the back of the room while his neighbors talked about him like he wasn't there. "The ranch is bringing down our property values," one man said. "I didn't pay $500,000 for a home just to look at a barn and smell horses." "It's a safety issue too," another woman added. "What if one of those horses gets loose? What if it kicks someone's child?" James raised his hand to speak. He explained that his horses were well trained, that his property was properly fenced, and that he'd been running this ranch for over a decade without a single incident. He talked about the kids he taught to ride. many of them from families who couldn't normally afford horseback riding lessons. He tried to make them understand that this wasn't just a business to him. This was his life, but he could see it in their eyes. They'd already made up their minds. To them, he was the problem. He was the thing that didn't fit. He was the obstacle standing between them and their perfect little community. After the meeting, Patricia approached him again, this time with a different tactic. She was all smiles and friendly conversation. She told him how much the HOA respected him and his service to the country. Then she made him an offer. "We'd like to buy your property," she said. "We think it would be better for everyone if this land could be developed properly." James asked what they were offering. When she told him the number, he almost laughed. It was less than half what his property was actually worth. They wanted to buy 15 acres of prime land for about the same price as one of their cookie-cutter houses. "That's insulting," James said. "It's a fair offer considering the circumstances," Patricia replied, her friendly mask slipping just a bit. "You have to think about this practically. We're not going away. This community is only going to keep growing. Eventually you're going to be surrounded. Wouldn't it be easier to just sell now and move somewhere more suitable?" "Suitable for who?" James asked. "This is my home. I'm not selling. Not for that price. Not for any price." Patricia's expression hardened. "Well, that's your choice. But I think you'll find that being stubborn is only going to make things harder for you." It sounded like a threat because it was a threat. James just didn't realize yet how far they were willing to go. Over the next few months, the pressure intensified. More complaints, more code enforcement visits, more discussions at HOA meetings about the problem of having a working ranch in their upscale community. Some of his clients started canceling lessons, saying they'd heard complaints from people in the neighborhood. James's business was starting to suffer, but he refused to give in. This was his land, his home, his dream. He'd worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let a bunch of entitled suburbanites push him out. But on a quiet Monday morning in early spring, everything changed. James woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. He looked out his window and couldn't believe what he was seeing. Construction crews were setting up along his eastern property line, the side that connected to the main road. And they were building a fence, not just any fence, a tall black wrought iron fence that looked like it belonged around a prison. James threw on his clothes and ran outside to see what was happening. When he got close enough to read the signs, his heart sank. The fence was being built on HOA common property, that narrow strip of land between his ranch and the access road. And as he stood there watching the fence go up, piece by piece, James realized exactly what they were doing. They were boxing him in. They were cutting him off from the outside world. And there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop them. At least that's what they thought. The construction took 3 days. 3 long days of watching that fence go up, post by post, panel by panel. James tried talking to the workers, but they just shrugged and said they were following orders. They had permits. Everything was legal. They were just doing their job. By Wednesday afternoon, the fence was complete. 8 feet tall, running the entire length of his eastern border. It looked solid, permanent, like it had always been there and always would be. But the real punch to the gut came when James walked down to inspect the finished work. Right in the middle of the fence was a gate. A single gate with a heavy-duty lock, and James didn't have a key. He stood there staring at that lock for a long time. This gate was now his only way in and out with vehicles. His old access road, the one he'd been using for 12 years, was now on the other side of that fence. Without access through that gate, he couldn't get his truck to his barn. He couldn't bring in feed deliveries. He couldn't load horses into trailers. He was trapped on his own property. The next morning, Patricia showed up at his door again. This time she wasn't alone. She had a man with her, someone in a suit carrying a briefcase. They looked official, planned, like they'd rehearsed this whole thing. "Good morning, James," Patricia said with that same fake smile. "This is Robert Mitchell from our HOA legal team. We wanted to discuss your access situation." James crossed his arms. "You mean the access you just blocked?" "We haven't blocked anything," Patricia replied smoothly. "The fence is on HOA common property. We have every right to secure our community." "That gate is my only way to the main road with vehicles," James said, trying to keep his voice level. "You know that." Robert opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "We've prepared an access agreement for you. It's quite reasonable, actually. You'll have use of the gate for legitimate ranch business. James took the papers and started reading. With every line, his blood pressure rose. The agreement required him to request gate access 48 hours in advance. Every single time. He could only use the gate during business hours, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. There were restrictions on the size of vehicles, restrictions on noise, restrictions on everything, and there was a fee. $500 a month for maintenance and administrative costs. This is insane, James said. I can't run a ranch with these restrictions. What if I have an emergency? What if one of my horses gets sick at night? That's what the emergency clause is for, Robert said, pointing to a paragraph buried in the legal language. You can request emergency access subject to approval by the board. Subject to approval? James felt his hands shaking. So if my barn catches fire in the middle of the night, I have to wait for your board to approve letting the fire trucks through? We would obviously approve legitimate emergencies, Patricia said. But we need to make sure this access isn't abused. We have to protect our residents. James looked at the last page. And you can revoke my access at any time for violations. Violations you get to define. This isn't an access agreement. This is extortion. Patricia's expression hardened. It's a take it or leave it offer. You want access to the gate, you sign the agreement. If not, well, I'm sure you'll figure something out. James handed the papers back. I'm not signing this. That's your choice, Robert said, snapping his briefcase shut. But just so you're aware, without a signed agreement, you have no legal right to use the gate. The lock will remain engaged. They left, and James just stood on his porch, watching them walk back through the one pedestrian opening in the fence. He felt trapped, cornered. They'd been planning this for months, probably, waiting for the right moment to spring their trap. The impact was immediate. That afternoon, a feed delivery truck showed up. The driver called James, confused. I'm at your road, but there's a locked gate here. Do you have a key? James had to meet the driver at the gate and help him unload 50-pound bags of feed by hand, carrying them one by one through the pedestrian opening and loading them into his truck on the other side. It took 2 hours. The driver wasn't happy, and he made it clear he wouldn't be coming back. 2 days later, James had a horse that needed to go to the vet for a routine checkup. Normally, he'd just load the horse into his trailer and drive out. Now he couldn't get his trailer through. He had to arrange for a mobile vet to come out, which cost 3 times as much. The following week, a family called to cancel their daughter's riding lessons. They'd driven out to the property and couldn't figure out how to get in. The pedestrian opening was easy to miss, and they assumed the ranch was closed. 2 more families canceled after that. James tried to find alternative access. He walked his entire property line, looking for another way to connect to a road. But his ranch was bordered on 3 sides by HOA properties now, and the 4th side was steep hillside that dropped into a ravine. That eastern fence wasn't just blocking his access. It was his only practical access. He spent his evenings researching property law, trying to understand his rights. He learned about easements and access rights, but everything he read seemed to suggest that because the fence was on HOA property, not his, there might not be much he could do. The HOA had technically left him with pedestrian access. Was that enough? He didn't know. What he did know was that his business was dying. Without the ability to bring horses in and out easily, he couldn't take on new training clients. Without delivery access, every supply run became a nightmare. He was spending more money on workarounds than he was making from lessons. One night, sitting at his kitchen table with a stack of bills in front of him, James realized what they were doing. They didn't need to buy him out anymore. They were making it impossible for him to make a living. Eventually, he'd run out of money. He'd default on his mortgage. The bank would foreclose. And then the HOA could probably buy the property from the bank for even less than they'd offered him before. It was a long game, and they were willing to play it. But James wasn't ready to give up yet. The next morning, he called a lawyer. Her name was Michelle Chen, and she specialized in property rights cases. Her office was an hour away, but James made the drive. Michelle listened to his story, taking notes. When he finished, she sat back in her chair and thought for a moment. They're smart, she finally said. Legally, they haven't done anything that's clearly illegal. The fence is on their property. They're not technically denying you access, just making it difficult. So there's nothing I can do? James felt defeated. I didn't say that. Michelle pulled out a legal pad. There's a concept called unreasonable interference with property rights. They may have the right to build a fence, but if that fence effectively landlocks your property and destroys your ability to use it as intended, that could be actionable. So we sue them? We can, but I have to be honest with you. These cases are expensive and they take time. The HOA has money and they have lawyers on retainer. They can drag this out for years if they want to. James thought about his dwindling savings. How expensive are we talking? Michelle gave him a number that made his stomach drop. That's just to get started. If it goes to trial, it could be double that. I don't have that kind of money, James admitted. Then we need to think strategically. Michelle tapped her pen on the desk. We file the lawsuit, but we also make noise. Media attention, social media, community pressure. Sometimes the court of public opinion works faster than actual court. Over the next few weeks, that's exactly what they did. Michelle filed a lawsuit against the HOA for unlawful interference with property access. But she also reached out to local news stations. She contacted civil rights organizations. She helped James set up a social media account to tell his story. The response was bigger than either of them expected. The local news ran a story. Then a regional paper picked it up. Then it went viral online. Suddenly, people all over the country were hearing about the ranch owner who was being fenced in by his HOA. Support poured in. People showed up at HOA meetings to protest. They sent emails to the board members. Some even drove out to James's ranch to offer help and encouragement. But the HOA didn't budge. If anything, the publicity made them dig in harder. Patricia released a statement saying the fence was necessary for community security, and that James was welcome to sign the access agreement anytime he wanted. She painted him as stubborn and unreasonable, refusing to compromise with his neighbors. Months passed. The legal case moved forward at a crawl. James's savings were almost gone. He'd taken out a loan just to pay Michelle's retainer and cover his basic expenses. The ranch that had once been profitable was now barely surviving. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late summer, Michelle called with news. She'd found something in the county records, something that might change everything. "James," she said, and he could hear the excitement in her voice. "How do you feel about buying some land?" James drove to Michelle's office the next morning, his mind racing with questions. When he walked in, she had documents spread across her desk and a look on her face that told him this was big. "Okay, walk me through this," James said, sitting down. "What did you find?" Michelle pulled out a property map and pointed to a narrow strip of land highlighted in yellow. "This is the 2-acre parcel where your fence and gate are located. It's HOA common property, right?" "Right. That's what they keep telling me." "Well, I was digging through county tax records for our case and I found something interesting. The HOA hasn't been paying property taxes on this parcel. It looks like an administrative mess. When they were setting up the development, this strip somehow got separated from the main HOA properties in the tax system. The bills were going to an old address, nobody was paying attention, and now they're almost 3 years behind." James leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "It means the county is about to put it up for a tax lien sale. When property taxes go unpaid long enough, the county auctions off the property to recover the debt. Anyone can bid on it." The implications hit James like a lightning bolt. "Anyone, including me?" "Including you," Michelle smiled. "If you win that auction, you own the land. The fence, the gate, the access road, all of it." James felt his heart pounding. "How much are we talking about?" Michelle ran her finger down a spreadsheet. "The back taxes plus penalties and fees come to about $48,000. But auctions can go higher if there are multiple bidders. You'd need to be prepared to go up to maybe $60,000 or $70,000 to be safe." James slumped back in his chair. "I don't have that kind of money. I've already drained my savings on legal fees and keeping the ranch afloat. What about a loan?" "I already took out one loan. No bank is going to give me another one, not with my business in the shape it's in right now." They sat in silence for a moment. James could see the opportunity right in front of him, but it might as well have been on the other side of the moon. He didn't have the money. It was that simple. "What if we crowdfund it?" Michelle suggested. "Crowdfund? You mean like online?" "Your story has gotten a lot of attention. People are invested in what happens to you. If we set up a campaign explaining the situation and asking for help, we might be surprised at the response." James wasn't sure. Asking strangers for money felt wrong somehow. He'd always been independent, always handled his own problems. But then again, this wasn't a normal problem, and maybe accepting help wasn't the same as giving up. "Okay," he said finally. Let's try it. They spent the next week putting together a crowdfunding campaign. Michelle helped him write the description, explaining the situation in clear terms. James recorded a video standing in front of his barn, talking directly to the camera about what this ranch meant to him and why this fight mattered. He talked about the kids he taught to ride, about keeping his land, about standing up for what was right. They set the goal at $55,000, figuring that would cover the auction and leave a little cushion for unexpected costs. James posted the link on his social media accounts and sent it to everyone who'd been following his story. Then he waited. The first donation came within 5 minutes. $20 from someone in Ohio with a message that said, "Don't let them win." Then another donation. And another. By the end of the first day, they'd raised $3,000. The support kept growing. Local news stations picked up the story about the crowdfunding campaign. People shared it on social media. Donations came in from all over the country. $10 here, $50 there. Some people could only give $5. Others gave hundreds. What got to James the most were the messages. People told him about their own battles with HOAs. Veterans thanked him for his service and said they had his back. Parents whose kids had taken writing lessons from him donated what they could. Complete strangers sent encouraging words and said they believed in him. 2 weeks later, the campaign had raised $47,000. James could barely believe it. He'd never asked for help like this before, and the response was overwhelming. People cared. They really cared, but they were still short of the goal, and the auction was only a week away. James lay awake at night doing math in his head. He could scrape together maybe another $5,000 from his credit cards and personal savings, but that would leave him with nothing if something went wrong. Then, 3 days before the auction, a single donation came through that changed everything. $10,000 from an anonymous donor with a simple message: "Finish the fight." James stared at his phone screen, reading the notification over and over. With that donation, they'd hit $57,000. He had enough. He actually had enough. The night before the auction, James couldn't sleep. He kept running through scenarios in his head. What if the HOA outbid him? What if there were other bidders he didn't know about? What if something went wrong with the money transfer? Michelle had assured him they were ready. The funds were secured. They had their bidding strategy. But still, James felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to either fly or fall. The auction was held at the county courthouse on a Thursday morning. James arrived early with Michelle, both of them carrying folders full of documentation. The room was set up with rows of chairs facing a podium where the auctioneer would stand. As other people filtered in, James tried to figure out who might be bidding against him. Most looked like professional investors, people who bought tax lien properties as a business. They chatted casually, checking their phones, clearly doing this kind of thing all the time. Then Patricia walked in with Robert, the HOA lawyer. They spotted James immediately, and Patricia's face went pale. She rushed over to Robert, whispering urgently. He pulled out his phone and made a call, stepping into the hallway. James felt a grim satisfaction. They'd finally figured out what was happening. They knew their mistake, and they knew he was here to take advantage of it. Robert came back in looking stressed. He and Patricia took seats on the opposite side of the room, having what looked like an intense conversation. Patricia kept glancing at James, and for the first time since this whole mess started, she didn't look confident. She looked worried. The auctioneer took his place at the podium and started going through the properties up for auction. Each one was announced with a parcel number and minimum bid. Some properties got no bids at all. Others had quick bidding wars that were over in seconds. Finally, the auctioneer called out the parcel number James had memorized. 2 acres, common area, Riverside County. Minimum bid $48,300. "Do I have a bid?" James raised his hand. $48,300. "We have 48,300. "Do I have 49? Robert raised his paddle. 49,000. 50,000. James countered immediately. 51. Robert shot back. The auctioneer looked between them. "We're at 51,000. "Do I have 52? James nodded. 52,000. Patricia was pulling on Robert's sleeve, clearly telling him to keep going. Robert looked uncomfortable but raised his paddle again. 53,000. 55,000, James said, jumping up his bid. There was a pause. Robert and Patricia were having a heated, whispered argument. James could see the panic on Patricia's face. They probably hadn't come prepared to go this high. Maybe they'd assumed nobody else would be interested in the property, or maybe they'd been planning to lowball it. "We're at 55,000, the auctioneer said. "Do I have 56? Robert slowly shook his head. Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but Robert was firm. They were out. Going once at 55,000, going twice. The auctioneer looked around the room. Sold for $55,000 to bidder number 17. James let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Michelle grabbed his arm, squeezing tight. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." Across the room, Patricia stood up abruptly and walked out, not even looking at James. Robert followed her, his phone already to his ear. As James signed the paperwork and arranged the payment, reality started to sink in. He now owned the land the fence was built on. He owned the gate. He owned the access road. The same road that 12 of the HOA's luxury homes relied on to get in and out of their properties. The tables had completely turned. Michelle walked out of the courthouse with him, both of them quiet until they got to the parking lot. Then James started laughing. Not a mean laugh, but the kind of laugh that comes from disbelief and relief mixed together. "They tried to trap me," he said, "and instead I ended up with the key to their cage." Michelle smiled. "So what are you going to do with it?" James looked back at the courthouse, thinking about everything the HOA had put him through. The harassment, the complaints, the fence, the months of struggling to keep his business alive. They'd tried to force him out to make his life so miserable that he'd have no choice but to leave. "I'm going to show them exactly what it feels like," he said. The key arrived in the mail 3 days after the auction. It was just a regular key, nothing special about it. But when James held it in his hand, it felt like the weight of the entire situation had shifted. This small piece of metal represented power, control, justice. Michelle called that same afternoon. "Have you thought about what you want to do?" James had thought about little else. "I want to give them a taste of their own medicine. Legally, you can restrict their access. But we need to be smart about this. We don't want to give them ammunition for a countersuit. What do you suggest? Let me draft an access agreement. We'll mirror what they tried to do to you, but we'll keep it defensible. Nothing that completely blocks access, but enough to make the point crystal clear." Over the next week, Michelle put together the agreement. It was beautiful in its simplicity. The 12 HOA homes that relied on that road for their primary access would now need to pay James an easement fee, $500 per month per household, the exact amount the HOA had tried to charge him. But the agreement went further. Any homeowner using the access would need to request permission 48 hours in advance for any large vehicles or moving trucks. Gate usage would be monitored. Excessive noise or speeding on the road would result in penalties. And James reserved the right to revoke access for violations of the agreement. It was their own playbook handed right back to them. Michelle also included a separate set of demands for the HOA board itself. Drop all pending complaints and violations against James's ranch. Issue a public written apology for the harassment. Make a $50,000 donation to a local youth equestrian program. And here was the big one. The entire current board needed to resign. Think they'll go for it? James asked after reading through the document. Honestly, the residents are going to lose their minds when they find out they're paying you $500 a month. That's $6,000 a year per household. The board is going to face a revolt. Good, James said. He wasn't being cruel. He was being fair. They'd tried to charge him the same amount. They'd tried to control his access to his own property. Now they'd understand exactly how that felt. Michelle sent the agreement to the HOA's legal team. Then they waited. The response came faster than expected. Robert called Michelle's office 2 days later. "We need to talk about this. Your demands are unreasonable." "Unreasonable?" Michelle put the phone on speaker so James could hear. "These are the exact terms your board tried to impose on my client. That was different. We were managing common property, and now my client is managing his property. The property he legally purchased at auction because your board failed to pay taxes on it." There was a long pause. "The board is willing to negotiate." "The terms aren't negotiable," Michelle said firmly. "You have 1 week to accept or reject. After that, we start enforcing the access restrictions and monthly fees." Robert tried to argue, but Michelle ended the call. James felt nervous. This was a huge gamble. If the HOA called their bluff and refused, things could get even messier. But Michelle seemed confident. "Trust me," she said. "Watch what happens next." What happened next was chaos. When the HOA residents found out about the access agreement, the backlash was immediate and fierce. James heard about it from one of his few friendly neighbors, an older man named Tom who'd never participated in the complaints against the ranch. "You should see the HOA Facebook group," Tom said, showing James his phone. "People are losing it." The posts were brutal. Residents were furious that they'd be paying James thousands of dollars a year just to access their own homes. They were angry about the restrictions, but mostly they were angry at Patricia and the board. How did they let this happen? One post read, "We pay HOA dues for competent management, and they literally gave away our access road because they forgot to pay taxes. This is embarrassing and expensive," another person wrote. "The board needs to go." An emergency HOA meeting was called for that Saturday. James didn't attend, but Tom went and reported back. The community center was packed. People were standing in the back because there weren't enough chairs, and they were out for blood. Patricia tried to maintain control, but residents shouted her down. They demanded explanations. How could the board be so careless? Why hadn't anyone noticed the unpaid taxes? Why had they antagonized James in the first place instead of just leaving him alone? One woman stood up and said what a lot of people were thinking. This whole mess started because the board decided they didn't like having a ranch in the neighborhood. They harassed this man, tried to force him out. And now we're all paying the price for their prejudice. That word hung in the air. Prejudice. Because that's what it had been, even if nobody wanted to say it out loud at the time. James was different. His property was different, and the board had decided that different meant unwelcome. The meeting ended with a vote of no confidence. Patricia tried to defend herself, tried to argue that they'd been protecting property values, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. By the end of the night, 3 board members, including Patricia, had submitted their resignations. Tom called James after the meeting. "You won't believe what just happened." James listened to the whole story, and for the first time in months he felt something like vindication. Not revenge exactly, justice. They'd tried to ruin his life, and instead their own leadership had collapsed. But the story wasn't over yet. The new interim board president, a man named David who'd moved to the community just 6 months ago, reached out to Michelle directly. He wanted to meet with James. No lawyers, no formal negotiations. Just a conversation. James was skeptical, but Michelle thought it was worth hearing him out. They agreed to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between the ranch and the development. David showed up looking tired. He ordered coffee for both of them and sat down with a heavy sigh. "I want you to know I wasn't part of any of this. I moved here right before everything escalated. When I heard what the old board did to you, I was disgusted." "Okay," James said, waiting to hear where this was going. "The residents are angry, and they should be. What happened to you was wrong. The way the previous board handled this whole situation was wrong. And now we're all stuck dealing with the consequences." David wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "I'm here to ask if there's a way we can fix this. Your board had a chance to fix it months ago. They chose to build a fence instead. You're right. And if I could go back and change that, I would. But I can't." David looked James in the eye. "What I can do is try to make things right now. The new board is willing to accept your terms. All of them." James felt his stomach flip. "All of them?" "The apology, the donation to the youth program, everything. We know we messed up. The question is, after we do all that, is there any way you'd be willing to negotiate on the monthly fees? $6,000 a year per household is going to hurt a lot of families." This was the moment James had been waiting for. The moment where he had all the power and they had none. He could squeeze them the way they'd tried to squeeze him. Make them pay, literally, for every month of stress and lost income they'd caused. But as he sat there looking at David's tired face, James thought about who he was. He wasn't the kind of person who kicked people when they were down. He'd been fighting to protect his home and his livelihood, not to punish his neighbors. "I don't want their money," James said finally. "I never wanted their money. I just wanted to be left alone to run my ranch in peace." David looked surprised. "So what do you want?" "I want fair access for everyone. I want permanent easement rights that nobody can ever challenge again. I want my business protected from frivolous complaints. And I want to make sure nothing like this can ever happen again. to me or anyone else. We can do that, David said quickly. We'll draw up a permanent easement agreement. We'll put protections in writing. No more harassment, no more complaints unless there's a genuine safety issue. And the fence comes down, James added. The whole thing. I don't want to look at it anymore, David nodded. Done. What about the land itself? The 2 acres you bought. James had thought about this too. I'll sell it back to the HOA. But at fair market value, not the cheapest price you can get away with. And the easement terms are non-negotiable and permanent. That's more than fair, David said, extending his hand. Let's make this right. James shook his hand, and for the first time since that fence went up, he felt like maybe this nightmare was actually ending. But there was still one more thing that needed to happen. One more piece of business to settle. And James was going to make sure everyone remembered exactly how this situation had been resolved. The negotiations took 2 weeks to finalize, but Michelle made sure every detail was ironclad. The new HOA board was surprisingly cooperative. They wanted this mess cleaned up just as much as James did, maybe more. The settlement agreement was comprehensive. The HOA would purchase the 2-acre parcel back from James for $175,000, the actual appraised market value. That was more than 3 times what James had paid at auction. With that money, he could pay back everyone who'd contributed to his crowdfunding campaign, cover all his legal fees, and still have enough left over to repair everything the months of struggle had damaged. But money wasn't the most important part. The easement agreement was. It guaranteed James permanent, unrestricted access to the main road. No gates, no fees, no permission needed ever. The agreement was recorded with the county, which meant it would stay in effect even if the HOA changed hands or new board members came in with different ideas. The HOA also agreed to contribute $50,000 to the local youth equestrian program that James had been supporting for years. The program helped kids from low-income families learn horseback riding, and it had been one of the first casualties when James's business started suffering. Now it would not only survive but expand. Then there was the apology. Michelle had insisted it be public and specific, not some generic statement that admitted nothing. The new board drafted a letter that was sent to every resident and posted on the HOA's website. It read, "The Meadowbrook Heights HOA Board of Directors wishes to publicly apologize to James Thompson for the harassment, discrimination, and unfair treatment he experienced at the hands of our previous board. Mr. Thompson's ranch has been a part of this community far longer than our development has existed. His business is legitimate, his property rights are absolute, and the previous board's attempts to force him from his land were wrong, discriminatory, and not representative of the values we wish to uphold as a community. We are committed to ensuring that no property owner in or around our community ever faces such treatment again." When James first read it, he had to read it twice. They'd used the word discrimination right there in black and white. They'd admitted fault. That meant more to him than any amount of money could. The fence came down on a Tuesday morning. James made sure to be there to watch. The same construction crew that had built it showed up with their equipment. This time, though, the mood was different. The workers knew the story. Everyone in the county knew the story by now. One of the crew members, a young guy named Carlos, came over to shake James's hand. "My family's been following what happened to you. My dad said you're a hero." "I'm not a hero," James said. "I just didn't give up." "That's what makes you a hero, man." Watching that fence come down panel by panel, James felt something release in his chest. It had stood there for almost 8 months, a constant reminder of everything he'd been through. Now it was just scrap metal being loaded onto a truck. By the end of the day, the fence was completely gone. In its place was an open view of the road that had always been there, the road James had used for 12 years before anyone decided he shouldn't have access to it. The gate went too, lock and all. James kept one piece, though. He asked the crew to save the gate lock for him. That night, he mounted it in a shadow box frame with a small plaque underneath that read, "Never underestimate someone who knows the value of their land and their rights." He hung it in his office, right above his desk where he'd spent so many sleepless nights trying to figure out how to save his ranch. It was a reminder, not of the bad times, but of the fact that he'd survived them. The local news covered the fence coming down. The reporter who'd first covered James's story came back to do a follow-up piece. She interviewed him standing in front of his barn with his horses in the background. "How does it feel to have this finally resolved?" she asked. James thought about the question. It feels like I can breathe again. But more than that, it feels like justice. Not revenge, just justice. The system worked eventually. It shouldn't have taken this long, and I shouldn't have had to fight this hard, but it worked. What would you say to other people dealing with similar situations? Don't give up. Document everything. Find good people to help you, whether that's a lawyer or just friends who believe in you. And remember that standing up for yourself isn't the same as being difficult. You have rights. Don't let anyone convince you to give them up just to keep the peace. The story ended up going viral again. News outlets across the country picked it up. It became one of those feel-good stories that people shared on social media, with captions like "Justice served" and "Never give up." But for James, the best part wasn't the attention. It was getting back to normal. Within a month of the fence coming down, his business rebounded. Delivery trucks could access his property again. He could transport horses to competitions. Families started booking riding lessons again. The youth program flourished with the HOA's donation. James was able to offer scholarships to twice as many kids. He hired an assistant instructor, a young woman named Riley who'd grown up riding at his ranch and had just graduated with a degree in equine studies. The program that the old board had tried to destroy by strangling James's business was now stronger than ever. Some of the HOA residents even became his customers. A few of them had been embarrassed by what their board had done and wanted to make amends. They signed their kids up for lessons, and James welcomed them without holding grudges. Their children weren't responsible for what had happened. Tom, the neighbor who'd kept James updated during the worst of it, stopped by one afternoon with his grandson. "The boy wants to learn to ride. Think you can teach an 8-year-old? "That's the perfect age to start," James said, and he meant it. One Saturday afternoon, about 6 months after everything was settled, James was working in his barn when he heard a car pull up. He walked outside to find David, the new HOA board president, standing there looking uncomfortable. "I hope it's okay that I stopped by," David said. "I wanted to see how you were doing." "I'm doing well. Better than I have in a long time." "Good. That's good." David looked around at the property. "I've been wanting to say something to you, and I'm not sure I've said it properly. What the old board did to you, it made me ashamed to be associated with this HOA. I almost moved when I found out the whole story." "But you didn't," James said. "You stayed and you fixed things. That matters. I just wanted you to know that you changed things around here. People are more aware now, more careful. The new board has strict policies about how we treat everyone, whether they're HOA members or not. We're trying to be better neighbors." James nodded. "That's all anyone can ask." After David left, James stood in his driveway for a while, just looking at his ranch. The barn he'd built with his own hands, the pastures where his horses grazed, the ring where he taught kids to ride. All of it was still his, still standing, still thriving. He thought about how close he'd come to losing everything. How easy it would have been to just give up and walk away when that fence went up. But he'd fought back, not with anger or hatred, but with persistence and the belief that he deserved to be treated fairly. The story had spread far beyond Riverside County. James got letters from people all over the country who were dealing with their own HOA nightmares. He tried to respond to as many as he could, offering advice and encouragement. His message was always the same: know your rights, stand your ground, and don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. 2 years later, James's ranch was more successful than it had ever been. The publicity had brought opportunities he never expected. A regional magazine did a feature on his youth program. A horse training facility in another state reached out about a partnership. He even got offers to speak at property rights conferences about his experience. But the best moments were still the quiet ones. Early mornings with his horses, the sound of kids laughing during riding lessons, the peaceful silence of living on land that was truly his, with no one trying to take it away. The gate lock still hung on his office wall, a permanent reminder of what he'd been through and what he'd overcome. Sometimes visitors would ask about it, and James would tell them the story. Not to brag or to vilify the people who'd wronged him, but to illustrate a simple truth. When you're in the right and you refuse to give up, justice has a way of finding its path, and sometimes that justice comes with a key in your hand and a gate that only you can open.